Welcome back, everyone. Today, we are diving deep into a conflict that absolutely reshaped the geopolitical map as we know it, the 2026 Iran War. This was a massive, system-shocking event that completely upended global trade and dragged in a dizzying array of international players. Our goal in this explainer is to untangle this incredibly complex web of causes, conflicts, and consequences. We're going to rely strictly on what we know from reports on the ground. We'll break down the timeline, look at the stated motivations of all the actors completely neutrally, and really map out where the world currently stands. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to start with one fundamental question. How exactly did we go from active, ongoing diplomatic talks to a massive, multi-front regional war basically overnight? I mean, it's easily one of the most jarring pivots from peace negotiations to all-out conflict in modern history. Let's look at the incredibly compressed timeline that brought the world to the brink. The sheer speed of this escalation was staggering. So back in January 2026, right after some severe crackdowns on anti-government protests within Iran, the United States initiated its largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. But despite this immense military posturing, diplomatic channels were actually still open. By February, indirect negotiations regarding Iran's nuclear program were actively happening in Oman, and both sides had even agreed to further technical meetings in Vienna. But that diplomatic window didn't just close, it completely shattered on February 28th when the US and Israel launched massive, surprise airstrikes right on Iranian soil. That brings us to Section 1, the outbreak of war, Operation Epic Fury. Whenever we examine a conflict of this magnitude, it's absolutely crucial to look at the stated motivations neutrally. On one side, the US and Israel framed these preemptive strikes as an absolute necessity. The Trump administration and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu argued the strikes were designed to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, to neutralize immediate threats to the US and its allies, and, as they stated in a video address on the day of the attack, to actually achieve regime change. Now, on the other side, Iran, along with various international critics and legal experts, condemned the attacks as an illegal violation of sovereignty and completely unprovoked aggression. They've really emphasized that Iran was actively engaged in nuclear peace talks when the bombs dropped, and pointed to intelligence suggesting Iran wasn't actually preparing any imminent attack on the US. What is truly shocking here is just the sheer magnitude and tactical surprise of that first 24-hour window. I mean, on February 28th, the Israeli Air Force struck over 500 military targets in western and central Iran. That is the largest combat sortie in its history. And this was coupled with a devastating cyber attack that dropped Iran's internet connectivity to literally 1% of its normal levels for 60 hours, effectively blinding government and civilian communication. On top of that, the strikes resulted in the assassination of several top Iranian officials, most notably Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Adding to this immense regional shockwave was the timing. These surprise morning strikes were executed right in the middle of the holy month of Ramadan. Well, Iran's response was instantaneous. They activated their regional arsenal in a major counteroffensive dubbed Operation True Promise IV. Within hours, they launched hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles. But here's the thing. They didn't just target Israel. They targeted U.S. military bases across the entire region and struck U.S. allied Arab countries. It took a targeted airstrike campaign and instantly turned it into a sprawling regional inferno. Suddenly, nowhere in the region felt safe. Which leads us into Section 2, regional escalation, a multi-front conflict. Those initial strikes spread like wildfire, drawing in a really dizzying number of actors. Looking at the major players, on one side, you've got the US, Israel, and allied Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait. On the opposing side is Iran and its axis of resistance, bringing in Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militias over in Iraq. But honestly, what's perhaps most concerning were the neutral or mediating nations, places like Qatar, Oman, and Turkey. They suddenly found themselves directly on the crossfire, dealing with airspace violations or having their facilities hit. The battlefield expanded with terrifying speed. Iran systematically targeted U.S. assets at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Ali Al Salam in Kuwait, and the U.S. Navy Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Meanwhile, over in the Levant, in response to Hezbollah rocket fire, Israel authorized a ground invasion into southern Lebanon. We literally saw ballistic missiles cross into NATO airspace over Turkey and drone strikes landing near British military facilities in Cyprus. Down south, the Houthis threatened to open an entirely new front by closing the Bab al-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea. The conflict completely spilled over its initial borders in a matter of days. Let's look at the global fallout in Section 3, the Strait of Hormuz, choking global trade. With the whole region engulfed, the ripple effects slammed into the global economy at one of its most critical choke points. The Strait of Hormuz is essentially a vital artery for global energy, and it quickly ground to a complete halt. Reports showed up to 150 freight ships and massive oil tankers just stalled out. Iran effectively enforced a total blockade of the strait, targeting commercial vessels and basically promising to set fire to any ship that tried to pass through. Obviously, this prompted a highly aggressive U.S. naval campaign to reopen the waterway, targeting Iranian naval vessels, radar stations, and drone bases. The real catch here is the difference between the physical reality on the water and the psychological impact of the war. Admiral Brad Cooper of U.S. Central Command testified to the Senate Armed Services Committee that the U.S. actually destroyed more than 90% of Iran's naval mine inventory. He said flat out that Iran's physical ability to stop commerce was dramatically degraded. But the perceived threat remained incredibly potent. As Admiral Cooper pointed out, even with diminished capabilities, the merchant and insurance industries are simply not going to risk traversing an active war zone, and that fear alone keeps global trade in a state of absolute paralysis. And that paralysis on the water, combined with these active military campaigns, came with a jaw-dropping price tag. Just within the first 3 weeks of the war, by mid-March, the estimated cost to the U.S. military alone hit $18 billion. Shortly after that, the Pentagon had to turn around and request an additional $200 billion just to sustain the campaign. It wasn't just the U.S. bearing the cost. The surrounding Arab countries, many of which faced direct missile and drone strikes hitting their energy infrastructure and airports, they suffered an estimated $120 billion in economic damage by the end of March. But for sure, the most devastating financial toll has been felt within Iran itself. By April, the Iranian government came out and assessed the maximum damage to their own economy. When you factor in destroyed military bases, crippled energy infrastructure, and the near total disruption of their trade, the estimate is an astounding $1 trillion. Which brings us to our final part today, Section 4, Stalemate and Global Impact, the World in Limbo. So, that staggering human and economic toll brings us to where we sit right now in May 2026. It's a highly volatile diplomatic limbo where we are hearing two very different claims of leverage. The U.S. and Israel assert outright military victory. They've testified that Operation Epic Fury destroyed 85% of Iran's drone, ballistic missile, and naval industrial base, arguing that Iran's military is so degraded it'll take a generation to rebuild. Yet Iran counters this narrative by wielding its economic leverage. Iran's parliament recently announced they're implementing a new professional mechanism in the Strait of Hormuz. They're trying to dictate that only cooperating vessels will be allowed passage and mandating the collection of transit fees. They're actively attempting to project control over the waterway despite the massive U.S. naval presence. Beyond the economics, Iran is utilizing this conflict to project a massive ideological shift. They're asking, are we witnessing the end of Western dominance? Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf recently claimed that the international system is at the cusp of a new order. He argues the traditional dominance of Western powers is eroding. By leaning heavily into their alignment with China and framing their survival of these strikes as resistance, Iranian leadership is really trying to position themselves as a vanguard for the global south. So, where exactly are we today as of May 17th, 2026? Well, on paper, there's a fragile ceasefire brokered back in April, but it is deeply, deeply strained. The Persian Gulf remains locked in this bizarre dual blockade, where the U.S. Navy is blockading Iran, and Iran is essentially blockading the strait itself. Meanwhile, the hostilities haven't actually stopped on the ground. Israel recently launched a massive series of airstrikes on around 100 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, despite a supposed truce extension. Diplomatic peace talks between the U.S. and Iran are completely frozen, though Pakistan's interior minister just arrived in Tehran to attempt some kind of mediation. And, hovering over all of this, in a truly surreal display of modern geopolitical posturing, President Trump recently posted an AI-generated image of himself and a Navy admiral standing in stormy seas with the caption, "Calm before the storm." Naturally, that has sparked widespread speculation that a renewed bombing campaign might be imminent. And that brings us to our final thought for this explainer. We are looking at a world that stopped on a dime in February and has basically been burning ever since. With a fragile truce constantly tested by ongoing strikes, these dual naval blockades choking the global energy supply, and diplomatic talks completely frozen, we have to ask, what will be the lasting geopolitical shift of the 2026 Iran war? Are we just witnessing a temporary, albeit horrific, disruption, or is this the violent birth of a completely new global order? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today. Stay curious, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.